Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Chandra Hodgson. I'm a professor in the School of Liberal Arts and Sciences. I'd like to welcome everyone here on behalf of the President's Lecture Series Committee to hear our third guest speaker of the academic year, Jamil Jivani, who will deliver a lecture titled Bridging the Divide Between Police and Community. Before we introduce Mr. Jivani, I would like to thank all of those people whose work has made the series possible. The committee members, besides myself, Jeff Bull, Melanie Shaparian, Angela Aujla, and Ian Gary. Humber's Media Services techs, the President's Executive Assistant, Deborah Green, and of course, Humber's President, Chris Whitaker, without whose support this series would not be possible. I'd like to take just a moment to preview the talks that we're going to have next term. On Thursday, February 4th, we're going to hear from Dr. Joe Schwartz. He's an author, radio show host, and he's the director of McGill University's Office for Science and Society. It's an organization dedicated to demystifying science and separating sense from nonsense. He'll be appearing at the North Campus in the 7th semester. On Wednesday, March 2nd, we're going to hear from Mark Hennick. He's a mental health advocate whose work has been informed by his own experience with the Canadian mental health care system as an adolescent. He was the youngest president of a provincial mental health association. He's currently the youngest ever board member for the Mental Health Commission of Canada. And that one's going to be here at the lake in the community room. Then, to finish off our series on Tuesday, March 22nd, we're going to hear from Dr. Lisa Kramer. She's a University of Toronto professor who's an expert in behavioral finance and neuroeconomics. She's going to help us understand the extent to which behavioral biases affect our financial decision-making. That talk's going to take place at the North Campus again in the 7th semester. So information about all these talks can be found on the President's Lecture Series homepage, where you'll also find an archive of our past lectures available for viewing. We also advertise in the communique, Humber TV, HSF bulletin boards, the event pages of Facebook, Google+, and you can follow us on Twitter using @HumberPLS. I'd like to take this opportunity to welcome everyone watching via live stream at the North and Orangeville campuses, and to extend a special welcome to students from the Criminal Justice Program who are in attendance today studying Principles of Sociology with Professor Alexander Schwartz. I'd like to remind everyone to silence all of your cell phones, please. And as you listen to the lecture, don't forget to jot down questions. We'll have a Q&A session following the talk. And if you have a question for Mr. Jivani, we'll ask you to speak into the microphone that's set up in the center of the room so that everyone can hear the question here and, of course, on the live stream as well. We also have this mic, and I will be able to bring it to anyone who needs that and can't make it to the mic in the center. And then there will be a reception with refreshments following the talk. I'd like to now turn the floor over to Shanique Reed. She's a student in the Criminal Justice Program who's going to introduce our speaker. Shanique?
Jamil Jivani is a lawyer and social entrepreneur based in Toronto. He is a graduate of Yale Law School, York University, as well as the General Arts and Science program here at Humber College. Since returning to Canada, Mr. Jivani has definitely kept himself busy. He has worked at the international business law firm, Torys LLP, and at the Tim Hortons Corporate Law Department. He currently serves on the board of directors for the Children's Aid Society of Toronto and the Yale Law School Executive Committee. He is a visiting scholar and professor at Osgood Law School, teaching and developing projects in the areas of community organizing, citizen empowerment, and democratic participation. Today, he plans to speak to us about the work of an organization he founded after graduating from Yale called the Policing Literacy Initiative, a grassroots public education and advocacy group focused on improving police-community relations. We are happy to have him participate in our series today. Please join me in welcoming Jamil Jivani.
Hey, how you doing, everybody? Can you hear me okay? Yeah? Okay. So I'm going to start over here so this side of the room gets some love. So I was actually a student at Humber about 10 years ago, which is crazy to think that it's been that long. And I was in, as Shanique mentioned, I was in the General Arts and Science program. Really cool to be back here. I've been back a couple times since I graduated, and it's like huge for me because prior to coming to Humber, I was actually like a really bad student. I struggled a lot, like through my teenage years especially, and coming here, I think a big part of my success was learning how to be a student, working on things that I actually had an interest in, and things that I cared about. So I had the chance for the first time to read and write about things like police and community and education and equality issues and rap music and like all sorts of stuff that were a huge part of my life, but I'd never really figured how to integrate them into my life as a student. So this work that I'm doing and like the stuff that I get to teach at Osgood Hall Law School and basically the last 10 years of my life has really been made possible because I figured out how to connect those worlds. And so if you're in a position where you're thinking about that, I really hope you think about how you need to bring a lot of yourself into what you do as a student, and it's a really big key to success. And my hope is that this talk today will be interesting to you, not just on a professional level, given that many of you are looking at these issues in the courses that you take here, but also on a personal level. And so my hope also is that I will only have to talk for about half the time we're here together, and that the rest of the time will be questions that you all have. So please keep that in mind as we go forward. Okay, so let's get started. So the title here, Bridging the Divide Between Police and Community. I think we see in the news every day that there are problems, not just in the US where we get most of that news from, but also up here. And so what I'm going to talk a bit about today, I'm going to go through about 5 things that I wanted to cover. The first is to talk a bit about Ferguson, Missouri, which actually it was a year ago yesterday that the grand jury decision came out that kind of led to a lot of what we've been seeing as far as like community action, Black Lives Matter, political action in response to police violence. So Ferguson is really important, and that's why I want to start with that. And then I'm going to talk about what Ferguson means to Canada and why it's relevant for us to think about what's going on in the US. Third, I'm going to identify, I guess, what I think is like a key part of the problem that is a common thread between all the challenges that we're looking at. Fourth, I'm going to talk about the conciliatory approach that I focus on in the work that I do on these issues. And then 5, I'm going to give you some thoughts on kind of where I think we're going as we move forward, in hopes that you also have some ideas on how to think through that as well. So, as I said, a year ago, as of yesterday, the grand jury decision came out where, regarding the death of Michael Brown, who is the young man on the right, 18 years old, killed in Ferguson, Missouri. The officer who killed him on the left is Darren Wilson, who was actually only 28 at the time. So we're talking about 2 young men who were in a situation that ended in a tragic way. And this wound up being, for many reasons, a catalyst for a lot of action, both in the United States and here. The killing happened in August of last year, but it was in November of last year where we had the grand jury decision. And that is where this gentleman, the prosecutor who was assigned to present the grand jury decision to regarding whether or not Officer Darren Wilson should be charged. And it was that I think was actually where you could say the floodgates opened up, right? Because after Michael Brown was killed, we had, there was some sense of optimism that perhaps the justice system might deal with it in a way where people not only in Ferguson, but across the United States, across Canada, across the world, felt satisfied. And when prosecutor Rob McCullough came out and said, in fact, we're not going to be charging Darren Wilson for murder, that's kind of where I think the faith of the criminal justice system evaporated to a point where people have just been desperate ever since to try to make something positive happen. So it was that night, which was November 24th, 2014, where I think the game changed quite a bit. And I think in particular younger generations of people all across North America started to realize that the justice system itself wasn't going to work in a way that they think it's supposed to as it pertains to dealing with these situations. And it was after this that we saw the same problem happen in Staten Island, in New York, with Eric Garner's death, and numerous other situations since then. So, and this is basically an image from the protests that started that night in Ferguson. And these protests are what has essentially gave rise to Black Lives Matter and numerous other movements since then that have been trying to draw attention to the fact that the criminal justice system, not just policing, but also the courts, prisons, pretty much every aspect of it has a proportionality problem, meaning that not only are some communities, and in particular black communities as it relates to Ferguson, are overrepresented, but when it comes to getting justice from these systems and these processes, these communities feel underrepresented, right? And so this is an image, and then this is what we saw in response to those protests that night, which I thought this was just an awesome picture with the season's greetings in the background and a bunch of police in riot uniforms. And it's these kind of images that I think were a huge part of what we've seen since last November, that people across North America and the world felt like there was an injustice happening, that the criminal justice system wasn't responding in a way that reflected what a lot of people felt was necessary in terms of actually trying to prosecute the Darren Wilson. And then you had, military grade equipment being used on protesters in Ferguson. So a mix of these factors just sparked a lot of different movements across the world, actually. And I think Ferguson is really key to understanding why exactly the last year has had so much tension, and why it's been so difficult to address what is really the trust problem and a confidence problem that I think a lot of people from all communities have in the criminal justice system right now. Okay, so what does this all mean to Canada? So I promise this is the most text you're going to see in the PowerPoint, but I wanted to just kind of outline some facts that I think are important. So when you think about why does a Canadian sitting in Toronto look at what's happening in Ferguson on CNN and feel like there's a connection to that? Well, that's because a lot of that same proportionality problems, both the overrepresentation and underrepresentation, exist here. So for example, Black Canadians are just over 9% of the federal prison population. That's a 3% increase basically in a 10-year period, and that's while Black Canadians are less than 3% of our overall population as a country. Those numbers are even more startling for Aboriginal Canadians, 23% of the Canadian federal prison population and just 4% of Canada's overall population. And then when you look at actual police interactions, it's tough because aside from federal prison numbers, there's not a lot of disaggregated data that gives you a good sense of what are the communities most represented in these systems. But the Toronto Star ran a bunch of data that they got through a Freedom of Information request from the Toronto Police, and were able to find that if you are a Black resident of Toronto, you are 4 times more likely than a white resident to be carded. Carding meaning that you are being stopped for no criminal investigation, but to have your personal information recorded by a police officer and then entered into a database. And the likelihood of Black residents to be carded increases significantly in whiter areas of the city. And that's a pattern that this data shows across every neighborhood in Toronto. And then you have here, the Special Investigations Unit, and this is an important distinction between what we do in Ontario versus what happened in Ferguson. So unlike in Ferguson, where they had an elected prosecutor who was going to present the grand jury decision, the grand jury with a case to make a decision about whether or not Darren Wilson should be charged with Michael Brown's murder, here we have a separate unit that's responsible for making that decision. That's not elected officials. They are well-trained professionals. But since 1990, when that office was created, there's still looming criticism that it's not independent enough from police, and that there are not incidents where deadly use of force against a Black civilian has led to prosecution, which is the problem that the Special Investigations Unit was designed to respond to. Because back in 1990, when this office was created, there were protests happening all across Toronto in response to the death of young Black men at the hands of Toronto police officers. And then lastly here is the G20 protest. And the reason why I included that is because I think for a lot of young people in our city, this was a key moment in defining their first interactions with police. Particularly if you're not from neighborhoods that tend to be over-policed, the G20 situation, which resulted in the largest mass arrest in Canadian history, mostly young people, many of whom are students, was a really abrupt, significant introduction to what it might look like to be policed. So I create this list here just to give you a bit of a picture of if you find yourself as part of the communities that are impacted by these systems, then what you see happening in Ferguson feels a lot closer to home than it might to a Canadian who's not feeling these processes, right? Play out in their own lives or in the lives of their family or their friends or their neighborhood. And it's an important thing for us to keep in mind when we think how relevant is what we see in American news and media to the problems that we face here in Canada. Okay. So I want to talk a bit about what I think the impact of not just Ferguson, but everything that's happened regarding police-community relations has been here since then. So this is a picture of an event that I helped organize at the City Hall in Toronto, where we had progressive police leaders and progressive community leaders all come together, and we all identified some common goals that we had for how we thought we could improve the way police and communities interact with each other. This was back in April of 2014, okay? So coming out of this meeting, I felt so much positive momentum. Like it really felt like we had some really good stuff that was gonna get done, that there were a lot of cynical and rightfully so community members who were willing to give Toronto Police a chance to see whether they were willing to change some of their behavior, particularly around carding, but also just generally about how they were interacting with people in low-income neighborhoods in Toronto. And on the police side, I felt a lot of positive momentum that they were willing to try to do some things a bit differently. Now, after April, right, so we're talking about just a few months between April and when Michael Brown was killed, the confidence that we were able to have from community members to actually sit down and talk to police dropped huge. And so the relationships that we were trying to build at this point in 2014, after all the drama and after all the things people were seeing in the news and all the scary stuff of, you know, what quite frankly amounted to execution videos that you could see on the news almost every night, it became really, really hard for us to get anything done. And so we were put in a position where we realized the police were becoming increasingly defensive because they felt like they were getting attacked, whether it was in the media or from community organizations or whatever it was. So they weren't really willing to listen the same way they were that day. And then community members were also like, hey, I'm not trying to talk to police. Like, they're out here killing people, right? And so the momentum we had at this point in spring 2014 started to gradually decline, and it put us in a situation where a lot of the hard work that I had done and that the team I work with had done since I came back from law school in summer 2013 started to become a lot harder to actually deliver on. And I think it's important for us to keep that kind of stuff in mind when we think, what exactly is the impact of every tweet that we see, right? Or every Facebook post or whatever the case. I think sometimes we don't realize that there's a collateral damage that happens when these kind of stories come out. And sometimes it's for good reason and sometimes it's not. But in the position of people who are trying to make these systems work better, it becomes tough when those situations, like we saw in Ferguson, define people's perceptions, right? And so we need to be cognizant of that and be mindful of what that means for when you go out into the neighborhood and you're trying to talk to people about how to engage with their police in a more positive way. They might just not want to hear it anymore, right? Because every time they go on their phone, on the computer, on the TV, they just see images that make them feel like that's not where their time should be spent. That's not where they should have their confidence in improving our society, right? Okay, so then we also have, in spring of this past year, a change in leadership in the City of Toronto's police. And so here you have pictured on the left the former chief, Bill Blair, who left that position in April. You have in the middle our mayor, John Tory, and then you have on the right our new chief, Mark Saunders, who started the position in spring of this year. And I think it's important to just be mindful of these issues that we're talking about, whether it's carding or racial profiling or generally the relationship between police and racialized low-income communities. These issues essentially defined much of the last year for these three men. So when Bill Blair left, despite the fact that for most of his time as chief, he was much more progressive on these issues than his predecessors, when he left, this was kind of his legacy, was that carding has been happening, everybody's frustrated, we don't know how to fix this. When the mayor walked in and joined the Toronto Police Services Board, which is essentially a mix of citizens and elected officials that oversee the Toronto Police Service, this became one of the first big public issues that he had to deal with. And then on the right here, Chief Saunders, this has essentially defined his entire first year as chief up to this point. And it's important to think about, like, this interconnection, right, of what we see in the United States and Canada, regardless of the differences we might have in our legal systems, regardless of the differences we might have in our processes, the fact that we are organized fundamentally differently and we do have different inequalities. If people don't feel those differences are there, if they feel like what we see in the US is the same as what they experience in Canada, then our elected officials and the people who are critically influential in our city are going to be dealing with those problems. And I think that's a reality that people in positions of power in our city, in our country, in our province are just starting to realize, is that you can change policies here, but if the hearts and minds of people are connected to those who are outside of your jurisdiction, they're still going to feel like those problems aren't being solved. And I think people who don't grow up in kind of the interconnected social media world that we all kind of live in now don't necessarily get that a tweet from Ferguson might mean a lot more than a change in law or policy in Toronto in terms of how people think and feel. And I think that's a lesson that these three men have had to learn and are still in the process of learning as it pertains to solving a lot of these issues. Okay. So let's talk a little bit about identifying the problem here, because I think there's a lot of issues at play, and you can spend a lot of time trying to figure out how do you hammer down a specific thing that we can fix, right? So in the work that I've done, I've worked with police departments across the US, in Toronto, looking at how law enforcement can be improved, and especially in how it deals with people who are in vulnerable situations. And I think that I've defined the problem in a way that I think is useful in the work that we do, but I want to make it clear before I get into it that I understand this is not the only problem at play. So I would encourage you, when we get into the Q&A period, let's talk about other things. This is not the only way of defining it. But to make the point that I'd like to make, I'm going to start with, this is the testimony that the officer Darren Wilson gave, or part of his testimony, to the grand jury in Ferguson. Darren Wilson, again, is the officer who shot and killed Michael Brown. And I'll just read it aloud. He's describing the area in which he encountered Michael Brown in Ferguson, and he says, "It is an anti-police area for sure. There's a lot of gangs that reside or associate with that area. There's a lot of violence in that area. There's a lot of gun activity, drug activity. It is just not a very well-liked community. That community doesn't like the police. That's not an area where you can take anything really lightly. Like I said, it is a hostile environment." So the reason why this quote of the very long testimony that Darren Wilson gives stands out to me is because I think it reflects the perception that some officers have when they come into some neighborhoods, right? If you come into a neighborhood where you assume everybody is hostile, where you define that neighborhood based on what is a small percentage of criminal activity in that area, then you're going to have a certain approach in how you talk to people. You're going to have a certain approach in how you treat people. You're going to have stereotypes. You're going to have various biases that you carry with you into your job. And so when you interact with someone like Michael Brown, you're not seeing an 18-year-old kid. You're not seeing someone who, might have done a petty crime, which is what they say he was being investigated over. You're seeing this guy who's a gang member, and he deals drugs, and he might have a gun, and he's not very well liked already, right? And he's hostile. And that creates a certain dynamic in how police interact with some people. And when we think about, like, how do we address the problem of how police and vulnerable communities interact with each other, these are the kind of perceptions that are at the core of the tensions and the distrust that we see. Okay, so An anonymous former Toronto police officer did an interview with the Toronto Star in 2013. And these are quotes from him. Again, this is a Toronto police officer. And in this, he's describing why carding and why police stops have racial disproportionality problems. So he says, if we see a white guy in a rich area, for example, and it's 10 o'clock, we just assume that he lives there. If we see a black guy, we're going to stop him because we assume he's checking out the neighborhood to commit a crime. But if you're talking about broad daylight and we have nothing to do, our superiors say we need to go out and card people. So we'll actually go out in the parks and whatever, and we'll look for guys who fit a certain description, who may not be wearing fancy clothes, and we'll harass them, like literally. And we call it a shakedown, right? And so what's important to know when you think about this is that since 2013, the Toronto Police did a very smart thing where they no longer ask officers to card a certain number of people. So the dynamic he's talking about where your superiors are telling you you need to go do it, theoretically doesn't exist anymore. But in terms of the attitudes that officers can carry with them into these neighborhoods, I think it's really important for us to think about this. And I think what I want to highlight here too is this is not that different from what Darren Wilson is talking about, right? And so the perceptions that officers can have when they're dealing with certain communities, black communities, low-income communities, racialized communities, can be very similar, even though we're in very different places, right? And so the laws and policies can be different between Toronto and Ferguson, but if the attitudes that officers have and the perceptions they have are the same, then we're going to see the same dynamics play out, right? And that's exactly what the statistics tell us, and that's what the feedback we get from community members tells us too. Okay. So there's another quote from Deputy Chief Peter Slowly of the Toronto Police Service. And he was a candidate to become police chief. He did a series of interviews talking about what he wanted to do if he did become police chief. And this is a quote from that interview which I think is really important. So disproportionality is a fact, but based on many factors including gender, age, and yes, race. Our 140 neighborhoods in Toronto are not homogenous. Racial bias on the police force is also a fact. What we have to do in the future is use the carding data to identify trends and, if necessary, correct officers' biases. Policing is an institution that is always a little bit behind the times when it comes to diversity and human rights. We've done a much better job in the last 10 to 15 years, but there's still a long way to go. And I wanted to include this because this is what I think good leadership in a police service looks like. This is what I think good leadership in a criminal justice system in various capacities looks like. It is being open and honest with people about the problems that exist and being open and honest about what police culture is like, what the criminal justice system is like, and the challenges that come with that in trying to solve these problems. Okay. And then finally, the U.S. Department of Justice did an investigation of the Ferguson Police Department earlier this year. And this is one of their conclusions that I think is exactly the point I'm trying to make here today, which is that many officers appear to see some residents, especially those who live in Ferguson's predominantly African-American neighborhoods, less as constituents to be protected than as potential offenders and sources of revenue, right? So this was their conclusion in trying to get what is the key, core, fundamental problem that led to what happened in Ferguson. And this is the main thing that they identified, which is just that law enforcement, the criminal justice system, is just not looking at people in some of these neighborhoods as people. They're not looking at them as people they are meant to serve, that they have some responsibility to. Instead, they're looking at them as either potential offenders or people that are sources of revenue. And what that means is people you can give tickets to, citations to, charge with various crimes that then bring in money to the city. And in Ferguson, that was found to be a big part of why they do so much police stops in black neighborhoods, is just as a way to get more money flowing into the city because it's a very underfunded police department. Okay, so now that I've kind of talked to you a bit about what I think the problem is, and again, what I'm saying is that I think a big part of this problem is perceptions, the kind of attitudes police officers have, the kinds of attitudes that exist in the criminal justice system, and the conception we have of what does service mean? What does community service mean? What does a social service mean? What does it mean to serve people in our cities? I think these are some ideas that will help with that, right? And I'm going to go over them including the new regulation on carding, because I'm hopeful that you might see them as at least first steps in trying to address some of these concerns. So the first one that I want to raise is body cameras. And this is the idea that President Obama has kind of grasped onto over the last year. It's one that he's asked Congress to fund. I think Calgary is the only major Canadian city that currently uses this technology at a widespread scale, but Toronto Police are piloting this with 100 officers right now. And body cameras, in short, as you can see, are an unsightly camera that a police officer will wear as part of their uniform to film their interactions with people in the community. The reason why this has become a popular go-to for people who are looking for ideas to reform police behavior is that in all studies that this has been tested in various jurisdictions across North America and Europe, it has proven to decrease the use of force, it's proven to decrease complaints about officers, and it also it has proven to mean that citizens and civilians treat officers with more respect. Everybody's behavior gets better, essentially, because there's a camera involved, and that camera helps with holding people accountable. So that's an idea that I think is the future of where we're going. Now, obviously, there are privacy concerns that come with this. There are numerous potential risks. For example, when can officers turn them on and off, and what is the expectation we have for how the video itself is going to be handled once it's recorded. Again, it's still in police control, so there are a lot of questions about that. But overall, I think that this is where things are going, and I think this is what we're going to see. The only reason why this, if it's not adopted by Toronto Police after the pilot, it's very expensive. It costs, I think, close to $10 million a year to operate this technology at the scale we would need in this city. So that's possibly why it wouldn't happen. But I think this is an idea that those of you who see your careers in the criminal justice system should start paying attention to this, because I think this is a big part of where our conversations about police accountability are headed. Okay, so then we have the regulation from the province. So the Ministry of Community Safety and Correctional Services announced a draft regulation, which, just so you're aware, we are in the middle of a 45-day review period of this regulation. So what that means is that you have until December 12th to read the regulation, give feedback to the ministry in hopes that they might change something if you think it should be changed. And if you are interested in doing that, please talk to me after today's talk, and I can kind of explain how that works. But there are two main pieces, I think, of the regulation that are relevant for what we're talking about today. The first is that we have on the left here I put a walking sign, because one of the requirements is that in many situations now an officer has to tell someone whether they have the right to walk away. And a big part of why that's important is that a lot of the police stops that have happened across Toronto have an element of them which you could call like psychological detention, right? Where a person, particularly a young person, who does not have to talk to a police officer, there's no like articulable grounds for why that person is being stopped, but because they're afraid or don't know that they have the right to walk away, might get stuck talking to an officer, might say something incriminating, or otherwise give up personal information that then gets put into a database, right? Even though they don't actually have to talk to that officer in the first place. So a big part of this new regulation from the ministry is they describe certain situations in which an officer has to proactively tell someone that they have the right to walk away, which is a pretty big deal if applied the right way. And there's a lot of debate right now happening about what situations does an officer actually have to do that in. And then the next picture I have here is of a receipt, a contact receipt. And basically what that means is that a second fundamental part of this draft regulation is that officers have to give people a receipt, again, in certain situations, subject to exceptions, but officers have to give people a receipt telling them who they are, who the officer is, their badge number, and the kind of information that would be necessary in order to follow up with a complaint or to figure out kind of what the officer has said about you and what they have entered about you into their database. So this is another critical step because, again, this helps with accountability, right? And it means that when they piloted these receipts in Toronto in the second half of 2013, carding went down 93%. because officers were putting themselves in a vulnerable position. If they card you and you shouldn't have been carded, but they give you their badge number, now it makes it easier for you to file a complaint. So it encourages officers to think twice before they stop somebody, right? So these are the two big pieces in the draft regulation. There's more to it. And again, I would encourage you, if this is stuff that interests you, to read the regulation and submit feedback to the ministry before December 12th, because it's a rare opportunity you have where you have a period where you can give feedback knowing that it will be at least considered before something becomes final law. Okay. And then there's another idea that I think helps address the problem I'm talking about. So, as I mentioned before with the receipts, in Ontario we have the Office of the Independent Police Review Director. They are the people who receive complaints about officers across Ontario. They have various ways in which they handle complaints depending on what the complaint is. The main distinction that you can think about complaints as is, are they serious in the sense that they would warrant a criminal investigation of an officer or not? So if they warrant a criminal investigation, then it's a very different process in terms of it actually engaging the criminal justice system to determine whether an officer needs to be investigated and potentially prosecuted. But if you file a complaint and it's not about a criminal activity, but you think it's because you were racially profiled, or you were disrespected by an officer, or you just thought their behavior was not acceptable as a citizen, then you can file a complaint, and one of your options is mediation. And that's kind of what this picture is here of Lego men doing a mediation. And basically what a mediation means is that you sit down with an officer, the person or persons that you have complained about, and you have the opportunity to actually tell them to their face what it is that bothered you, what was the problem. And they have the opportunity to explain to you why they stopped you. And this is something that I have been encouraging people to do a lot, because I realize that a lot of the interactions that break down the trust between police and community members are things that are not necessarily serious enough that would warrant an investigation, right? As I said, it could be racial profiling, it could be disrespectful, it could be, you're hanging out outside and an officer comes by and talks to you like you're doing something wrong when you haven't. And I think those are actually bigger detriments to building positive community police relationships than a lot of the more serious things you might see on the news. However, people don't follow up with them, right? So they just take that anger and they take that frustration, they just keep it with themselves. So what a mediation does is that it encourages people that even though you might not be able to take a police officer to court for how they treat you, you still have some remedy. And through that remedy, you might actually be able to help an officer think differently, and the officer may also help you think differently. But at the end of the day, it's designed to try to increase the mutual understanding that people in the neighborhood have with the officers that serve their community. So it's something that I've gone through when a police officer stopped me, and I highly recommend it because I think it just humanizes everybody a lot more, and I think puts everybody in a better position at the end of the day. And then lastly, police budget stuff. So this is a picture of a budget. So there's a lot of discussion about police budgets, how they're allocated, how they're used. Police in Toronto, for example, are the biggest expense for the city of any service, more than transit, more than the schools. It's huge. And having conversations about how those resources get allocated and what we expect from police services is really important. So just when I say this, what I'm trying to get at here is we're spending, of the over $1 billion a year that we spend on police in Toronto, over 90% of that goes to salaries and benefits, right? So these are people costs. So when we are spending this money, I think it's important for us to think about what do we want these officers to be doing, right? Since we're spending almost $1 billion on officers to be out in these communities doing various things related to public safety, are there things that they're not doing now that they could be better spent doing? And one example of that is starting to think about how officer time and resources could be better spent to proactively address the causes of crime and not just responding to crime after the fact. And when you think about how a budget plays into solving the problem of police community dynamics, what I'm trying to get at here is that if you are able to think about how police can behave in a way that actually make people's lives better before they might commit a crime, then I think that's exactly what we need to see from the perspective of people who are being over-policed right now, right? The neighborhoods that are over-policed in our city, like most other cities in North America, are neighborhoods that actually need the most help. They need jobs, they need better education, their schools aren't as good as other parts of the city, their housing isn't as good. And if the money we're spending on police could be spent in a way that might actually address some of those issues and make people's lives better, then I think people will have more confidence and faith that the criminal justice system is actually there to help them and not just punish them, especially punish people who are in the most vulnerable positions in our society. So those are some of the ideas that I think are important to consider. I think there are opportunities to affect all of these things right now, and as you think about your own potential careers in the criminal justice system, these are all things that you could be thinking about and getting involved with ASAP, right? And before I leave the budget conversation, there's likely going to be a review of the Police Services Act from the Government of Ontario at some point next year. My guess is middle next year as we get into the summer. And as people who are looking at all these issues, and as students and people who are, I'm sure, have a lot of good ideas, you should think about playing a role in that review of the Police Services Act, because there's a lot of changes that are going to happen, and it would be great to have you involved in kind of thinking about what do you think the Police Services Act should look like when you're in positions of leadership at all these different levels of the criminal justice system. Okay, so future police and community. So I want to go back to this quote from the U.S. Department of Justice, because I really think this is like a key here. I think that we have two problems. One is that the criminal justice system historically and presently has an issue with treating certain people as constituents, as defining their role as a service, right, that is there to actually be responsible to the needs and wants that people have. And not only is I think this is a problem in Ferguson, but I think this is a problem in most parts of Canada as well. So when I think about what the future of police and community interactions look like, I think redefining this is actually the main challenge that we have, which is how do we construct a criminal justice system that sees the communities that might be most vulnerable to crime as constituents that they're responsible to, rather than as people to punish on behalf of the rest of our society, right? And I think that distinction is going to be very, very important to addressing this. And then another part that we need to think about too, and this is, you know, the slogan of Toronto, diversity, our strength. So the dynamics in the criminal justice system right now are kind of archaic. And what I mean by that is we still have a bit of a majority-minority complex in how we think about these problems. We still kind of assume that white people and people of kind of European backgrounds are the majority of Canada, and we are designing our criminal justice system and various other processes to respond to minority concerns. But in Toronto, there's actually no majority group, and there's actually no minority group. Like it's a pluralistic city, right? And so how do you design a criminal justice system and a police service that no longer thinks of some people as majority and some people as minority, but instead that like everybody has an equal stake, everybody has an equal voice, and that we need to learn how to be flexible and nimble enough that people of all linguistic and cultural backgrounds need to be served properly and equally by our public services, right? And that's really, I think, the challenge that we're seeing, is that the dynamics and the demographics of our cities, both in Ferguson, in Toronto, in Baltimore, in DC, in Chicago, in New York, Calgary, Vancouver, are changing faster than the leadership of our public services are. So our public services reflect an older version of Toronto, for example, than our actual population does. And we're struggling right now with how do we connect those two things? How do we make sure that the leaders we have, both at the city level, provincial level, federal level, actually understand the needs and are responsive to the various diverse needs of people in our city? And these are the kind of growing pains that I think cities are going to be going through most of the rest of the next decade, maybe 2 decades, where they try to figure this one out. Because right now, we're transferring from majority-minority dynamics to pluralist dynamics everywhere across North America. And that's like where the future of, I think, criminal justice is knowing that we have a very diverse city, very diverse province, very diverse country, and that we need to build public services that can serve everybody equally and not just be reflective of one majority set of concerns, right? So that to me is the challenge that you all are going to have in your careers, those of you who get involved in various forms of public service, whether it's in criminal justice or not, whether you want to be educators, whatever it is you want to do. That's the challenge of like our generation, is figuring out how to make that transition work in a way that's actually positive and not going to create more division, but actually bring people together, right? So I'm going to leave it at that in hopes that you guys will have questions about anything that I've said. And I'm happy also to talk more about the draft regulation on carding if that's something that you want to talk some more about as well. So, all right, that's it. I don't know, let's just leave this thing.
Great. So we have time now, of course, to take some questions from the audience. I want to remind you all that we want to hear what you have to say, and they also want to hear what you have to say if they're watching from the North Campus or Orangeville or whatever. So we need you to come up to that mic and just form an orderly line in order to ask your question. I also have a mic here that I can be mobile with if anybody needs a mic brought to them in order to be heard.
The professor in me is also really comfortable just cold calling you, so it's more fun though if you actually want to ask a question though.
I'll ask a question.
I think you got to go to the mic so that
Mic, please.
you,
Is it on?
Michael.
Me?
Yeah.
Nice. You can probably hear me like
Yeah, yeah.
Well, Mr. Jivani, I want to thank you for being here. That was an excellent speech. You very briefly touched on accountability measures, especially with the body cameras.
Yeah.
Now, we know that you mentioned that they are very expensive, and the issue is always a budgetary issue when it comes to rolling out these measures. So what I want to know is, as police officers, the huge issue is the mistrust in public, and how do you effectively protect a public that fundamentally mistrusts them? So I'm sure as police services, they would welcome these accountability measures as well. But how do you reconcile the two between public safety resources, allocating resources for public safety, or accountability measures? And if something needs to take a precedence where there is a conflict, what do you think should be placed up higher on the list?
So just so I'm understanding you, are you talking about basically having a balance between the accountability, like you want to hold people accountable, but you don't want that to come at the cost of people being safe?
Of course.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Well, I mean, that is the like $1 million question with like all police reform, right? And even with like the regulation on carding, for example, the police associations across the province are very unhappy with, for example, having to tell someone the right to walk away, which is like a key thing for, informing people of their rights, but might make it harder for them to actually gather the intelligence they need to solve crimes, right? So every aspect of what I talked about, I think that the tension you're talking about is relevant. Part of what I think needs to be figured out, though, is that the police are operating from a position of a deficit of trust, right? And so they are going to need to kind of go above and beyond, I think, in order to kind of overcome that. And part of that means saying to people that, we are willing to kind of go work extra hard, we are willing to go the extra mile, we are willing to make our lives more difficult in order for us to kind of gain that trust. So when it comes to like body cameras as an example, I think they need to be able to understand that it's worth the money because public trust costs money, right? And that like when you just think about things as like a ledger of like costs and benefits, I think the intangibles of like public confidence don't get accounted for enough. But when we're talking about like whether is it worth $10 million for people to feel safe in our city, right? Is it worth $10 million for people to feel like when they're stopped by a police officer they might not be beaten up? Right? Like, I think it's worth $10 million. And I think that's the kind of calculation that we need to start getting toward, where we're assuming that those things cost money, right? Not just in terms of like the lawsuit expenses, but also just because in order to operate effectively, it's going to make the life of a police officer easier if people want to talk to him or her, right? So I think that's the real problem, is that we haven't quantified that. Like, what is trust worth? What is confidence worth? What is, and that's a key part of safety too, right? Yeah.
regarding the carding issue, there's a lot of disconnect between, I guess, the people in the suits or the higher up positions in policing,
Yeah.
and then what's on the ground and how it is supposed to be actively sought out. How do we address those gaps?
You mean people making decisions at, like, at a policy level
And
versus
then
the
it coming down on the
officers?
ground.
Yeah. No, I mean, that's a huge one, right? And so police leadership, and I think partially why, there was that quote from Deputy Chief Slowly about kind of police being behind the times in diversity and human rights often. And I think a big part of that is because police leadership needs to maintain that kind of like credibility with officers, right? And so they do need to, despite the fact that there might be like a good policy change that needs to happen, they need to get buy-in from everybody, and that takes time. Because if you make an abrupt change without the buy-in of your officers, you're never going to get them to actually change anything on the ground. So I think that's like a great point. The challenge right now with the carding reform is that, and this is like an interesting thing for everybody to keep in mind. So carding provided the data necessary to prove that racial profiling was happening. If you take carding out, then you have police stopping people but with no record of it. And so you don't know that they're actually stopping more black people than white people, for example, right? So now that you are changing carding, if the behavior of officers isn't any different, and they're just not writing it down, but they're still stopping people the same way, then how is it, then nothing's actually improved, right? And so a big part of what the ministry is trying to figure out is like, how do you develop a kind of training mechanism that will mean that it actually goes from the top down in the organization? And that takes like a lot of time. And unfortunately with these problems, I don't think people, no one's very patient, right? Like people want this to stop now. They want like racial profiling to stop now. They want people to be safer now. And that's like a really hard thing to guarantee at this point, right? Because it's going to take time for this policy to take effect. It's going to take time for it to impact officers on the day-to-day. And really, I think the only way to go about it is to do like as much training as possible, but also to put officers in like unfamiliar situations as much as possible, right? So the more they're doing things like hanging out with kids at a school, helping with community programs, helping with youth programs, going to spend time with social workers to see what that's like, going to spend time at a legal aid clinic to see the kind of legal challenges that people in their division catchment area have. Those are the kind of things that I think are going to kind of open their minds and have them act a bit differently. But if they're just kind of living their life as a cop over and over again the same way, it's going to be hard for them to break their habits. Yeah.
The background behind carding, it seems to me an obvious violation of our charter rights. So how did the policy get enacted in the first place?
Yeah, good question. Basically, it's an idea that makes police lives easier because it gives them access to an informal record, right, of everyone in a neighborhood. And I think when the idea initially came up, it was seen as like a way of like maybe just being like a gang members database, for example. But I don't know if you guys remember, in 2005 was the year of the gun, and that just put a ton of like energy and resources behind much more draconian ways of policing. And so carding just kind of got way out of hand. Like it became like a place where everyone's getting carded. Like in a 10-year period, they filed 4 million contacts, right? Contact cards. Like that's an outrageous number. So I think that it got way further out of hand than it was initially intended to. But your point about the charter, I think, is right. Like there are cases happening right now that are trying to bring a charter claim about this, and I suspect that the arbitrary nature of how carding works is going to be where the charter conflict comes into play. I don't think it would survive a charter challenge. I think the idea is that this ministry regulation might avoid a charter challenge needing to happen. But to keep just to your point, though, this ministry regulation is regulating carding. It's not making carding illegal, right? What they're saying is if you put more rules around carding, then it no longer becomes a violation of rights. We'll see whether that's true or not. But I think if it goes to court, I think you're right. It will be seen as a breach of the charter, because the charter is pretty explicit about like the need for arbitrariness is a problem. And I think in the way carding has happened, it's been very arbitrary. Yeah. But we'll see. I think at some point next year it should go to court. So we'll see. Yeah.
You mentioned a really interesting quote, which I liked, where you said the areas in Toronto which we over-police tend to be the areas which need the most help.
Yeah.
And you were talking about how do we use police funding better? Where do we target it? So what I've always thought about, and in the research and studies, is the importance of community policing.
Yep.
But true community policing, where we actually go into communities and we say, what do you guys need?
Yep.
Right? So like making decisions at the higher level of saying, okay, we know Jane and Finch is a high hotspot, high crime area, we got to send 6 times more cops there, as opposed to the community policing strategy where we go to Jane and Finch, we speak to community leaders and we say, what do you guys need?
Yep.
Do you need housing? Do you need better schools? Do you need better health care? Do you need better programs? So just wanted to see your thoughts about that.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. So I think one of the challenges of community policing is that you take officers through the exact same police college, the exact same training, the exact same education, and then say to some of them, you're going to go like hang out at the school. But without recognizing that they probably should have different background, professional and training backgrounds if they're going to have those different functions. So I think genuine community policing would mean that every division station has like youth workers and social workers employed, right? And that it's a mix of people with different talents and skills who are out there trying to solve these like bigger problems of like how do you put people in a position where crime is less of an option for them, right? And that's not what's happening. So instead you have a bunch of officers all trained the exact same and thinking that they will have the capacity and skills necessary to go out into a community and build different kinds of relationships with people, but they've never actually been trained to do that. Like it's a very different, I mean, you all will know, depending on what you guys decide to do with your careers, that like you have to make decisions about where you want your skills development to happen. And right now it's all a homogenous skill set across the board, right? But we're asking that homogenous skill set in Jane and Finch, for example, where I live, to be applied in different ways than you would apply that homogenous skill set in like Rosedale. And that it's just not a way you solve a problem. So that 93% or whatever it is of the $1 billion police budget, in my view, should go toward like employing people of different professional backgrounds, right? People who can actually help officers learn how to build those relationships, who can be a resource when an officer is a first responder because a young person is in like a situation of crisis, that you're bringing like a social worker with you because you need people who know how to do that stuff, right? So yeah, I mean, I think that's a key part of it, is like, how are you doing the training for law enforcement? And is law enforcement just police in the traditional sense, or is it also police plus social workers plus youth workers plus various other skills that you would need, right?
And what I'm hearing from some community, because they're doing a project, I think, at the School of Community and Justice Services, working with police officers, and when I question them and ask them, they say, we're actually doing some of that, and what we're doing is we're partnering with different organizations. So when we go to a location and they say, our problem is really poor housing, they go, oh, that's okay, because we have a connection to a housing agency where we can get them to come in and help you. So are you finding that seems to be the case, or it's
Yeah,
more?
no, they definitely do a lot of partnerships. The question just becomes like, is that the most like efficient and effective way of actually trying to address the problem, right? So just one thing that, when we think about like what are the things that police know about our city that pretty much no one else knows, is that they know the worst situations in our city. Like they are the first people to show up in the most traumatic, scary, violent, uncomfortable situations that people in our city get themselves involved in. So they do have a knowledge base that's helpful in solving other problems. So they are good partners, but their partnerships are all kind of like random, right? Like there's no, like as a taxpayer, when I look at it and say, okay, well, you're building a partnership, I don't know what your partnership looks like. So how am I supposed to hold you accountable to solving a problem when your partnership seems to be very informal? It's kind of based on however you like it. It's not really something that like we as people in the city get to say that we're holding them account to, right? And I think that's the kind of thing when I say why having in-house people working on housing or in-house people working as a social worker, it helps us understand how those relationships are actually playing out. But an external partnership could be good relationship, could be bad, we don't know, right? And whereas an in-house one, we have the ability to actually see how those dynamics are playing out. Yeah. Yeah, go ahead.
A lot of the responsibility of community policing tends to fall on the shoulders of police officers. We're going into situations where now we're not only officers, but we're expected to be like social workers or taking on these other roles that we may not be trained for. But where does the community come into play? Where is their responsibility of this relationship? We kind of lose sight of it at times. So where does their role come in, and what are they supposed to be doing?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think depending on the problem we're looking at, there's like different responsibilities that people have, right? So if we're talking about like violent crime, for example, most of that is, you know, stuff that is a lot of systemic issues that are playing out. Like a kid who, for example, is involved in a gang is likely to have various other forms of issues with city services, like might not be engaged in the school system, might have access to inadequate housing, not proper like supervision at home, various other things. And it's unfair to expect a police officer to be able to solve all of those problems, right? So like I take the point that there's a lot more complexity involved in this. I think the thing that's important to think about though is that like, I don't think, I think police officers can be advocates, though, in helping those other types of agencies to understand how to solve the problem. And right now, that's not what's happening, right? So if a police officer understands crime in a community and says, look, I know that we need like children's aid to be more involved, or we need the schools to be more involved, then being a voice for those people and assuming the responsibility of helping those other agencies get better is an expectation that I would have of an officer. But when that's not what's happening, because the police don't understand the community well enough, or for example, TAVIS is like a really, I don't know if you all know what TAVIS is, the Toronto Anti-Violence Intervention Strategy. It's a group of officers that have no base in the city, and they kind of go around to different parts of the city depending on where there might be a high-profile crime. They don't have any intimate knowledge, right, of like what's happening in a neighborhood. They don't know the people. They don't know who's a criminal and who's not. They have no understanding of how to talk to people. And so when they kind of rush into a neighborhood, that's not really a way of policing that I think does what you're talking about, which actually helps solve a social problem and is clear on what the responsibility of an officer is. That type of policing just goes in like a bulldozer, right? And actually produces more problems, I think, than it solves. So I think if police officers do their job the right way, then they can come back and say, hey, what's the community's responsibility here? But if police aren't doing their job the right way, they can't expect more empathy from the community than they're willing to give back, right? And I think when we talked about before about like the deficit position that police are starting in, I think you have to be mindful of the fact that like police are in a position of privilege, right? And so you're going at, like police officers are well-paid, well-trained city employees who walk into places where people are suffering and have to figure out how do I interact with them in a way that's positive. But that's a responsibility they have to take on. We can't go into neighborhoods where people don't have adequate housing or adequate education, people don't have jobs, and expect they're gonna have more empathy for an officer than an officer is willing to have for them, right? And so if officers can lead by example, then I think community members will understand, okay, I will take my responsibility in this and try to solve it. But if officers aren't leading by example because they're not showing the kind of empathy that we need to see, then it's going to be really tough to expect community members to be like, okay, what's my role in this, right? So that's what I would say. It's about like leading by example and showing people how do we behave as good citizens, right? And police got to set that tone. Yeah, and take that responsibility on, you know? Other questions?
Do you think that a more diverse police force would help, lower the bias and stereotypical views, opinions that some police officers or the police force has in Toronto?
I do think it can, but it depends on how we define diversity, because I think it can be defined in a lot of different ways. So diversity where people just look different, I don't think solves the problem. Diversity where people speak more languages, where we have like more gender parity, all of that can be good, but it doesn't necessarily solve the problem. To me, the kind of diversity we need is experience diversity, right? So like if you're policing in Jane and Finch, for example, and you grew up there, that sounds like the kind of diversity I'd like to see. Or if you have various different, for example, if you talk to officers, a lot of good officers about what makes them good at their job, a lot of it is that they have family and friends that help them understand what another person's life might be like, right? And so people like that who do have those kind of relationships and have those experiences, that's the kind of diversity we need, like as much of it as we can get. But other kinds of diversity can be good, but not necessarily help solve this problem exactly, right? And I think that's the one thing we have to be mindful of. And actually, just to give Toronto credit, we actually do have one of the most diverse police services in the entire world. and we speak at, like, they send Toronto police representatives at conferences across the world to talk about how to diversify your service, because we're actually really good at that. I don't know if we're good at the kind of diversity I'm talking about, but we are good at more cultural, ethnic, gender diversity. We do a good job at that.
What about like more proportional diversity? So like based on Toronto's population and the police population. So like having like as much females in the police force as there is population of the female population in Toronto.
Yeah, I think that could work. I mean, one thing to think about too, though, is so it's proportional based on like census data, and then it's proportional about where the needs are, right? So, if, for example, a big part of police resources are going into neighborhoods where most residents are black or brown, then, but we're using census data, we're talking 8%, 9% of officers are black. But in order for effective policing, we might need more than that, right? And so I think census data can be good, but also it just depends on, I think, the problems you're trying to solve. Yeah.
Great. Thank you so much for those great questions. And please join me in thanking Jamil and Jivani for coming and sharing with us today.
Yeah, you guys were awesome. And if you want to talk about anything, I'm going to kick it for, at least until like 1:30. So I'm happy to talk some more about whatever you'd like to chat about.
Yeah, I do have a reception now, so you'll be able to help yourselves to refreshments and discuss with each other and with our speaker. Thank you for coming.
Okay.
Exactly, yeah.
Oh, is that not? Okay, good. It's hard to tell.